The stagecoach lurched to a final stop as dusk painted the sky in shades of copper and ash. Clara Bennett gripped the worn leather handle of her traveling case and stepped down onto the packed dirt of Red Hollow's main street. The November wind cut through her woolen coat like a blade, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and distant snow. She stood there for a moment, tall and still as a prairie sentinel, watching the coach driver toss down her trunk with practiced indifference. The other passengers had already scattered to their destinations, a merchant to the hotel, a young couple to waiting relatives, but no one waited for Clara. The letter in her coat pocket promised employment at the widow Morrison's boarding house, along with a small room of her own. It had seemed like Providence when she'd received it back in Kansas City, where she'd been surviving on her meager savings and the occasional nursing job. After the war with Mexico, there wasn't much call for Army nurses, especially ones who carried themselves with Clara's particular brand of quiet severity. She lifted her trunk by its leather straps, her strong hands barely trembling despite the cold. The main street stretched before her, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned against each other like drunken companions. Lamplight spilled from the saloon windows, accompanied by the tinny notes of a poorly tuned piano. Somewhere, a dog barked at the gathering darkness. The Morrison boarding house stood at the far end of the street, its painted sign barely visible in the fading light. Clara made her way toward it, her boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk with determined precision. She'd learned long ago that purpose in one stride could ward off most unwanted attention. But as she approached the two-story building, something was wrong. No light shone from the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. A piece of paper, yellowed and curling at the edges, was tacked to the front door. Clara set down her trunk and climbed the 3 steps to the porch. In the dying light, she could just make out the words, "Closed due to illness. God willing, we shall return." The date on the notice was 3 weeks old. She stood there, reading and rereading the brief message as if the words might rearrange themselves into better news. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and sending dried leaves skittering across the porch like tiny bones. Clara had $17 to her name, a sum that would perhaps secure her a week at the hotel if they'd accept an unaccompanied woman. She'd already noticed the absence of other single women on the streets. This was cattle country, mining country, a place where men outnumbered women 5 to 1 and respectability was guarded with the fierce devotion of the scarce. She descended the steps slowly, considering her options. The hotel was out of the question. She needed her money to last until she could find work. The church, perhaps, though she'd learned that Christian charity often came with more strings than a marionette. As she stood there in the gathering darkness, a gust of wind brought a shower of sparks from somewhere nearby. She followed the orange glow to its source, the back of Murphy's saloon, where a small fire burned in a makeshift hearth built into the side of a woodshed. The shed itself was 3-sided, built against the saloon's rear wall, filled with split logs and kindling. Someone had fashioned a crude fireplace from stones and mortar in one corner, probably for the use of whatever unfortunate soul Murphy hired to split wood. But at this hour, it stood empty. Clara made her decision quickly. She'd slept in worse places during the war, tending to wounded soldiers in barns and burned-out haciendas. She dragged her trunk around to the back of the saloon, keeping to the shadows. The noise from inside the establishment would mask any sounds she might make, and the fire would keep her from freezing. She arranged her trunk as a windbreak and settled herself on a pile of wood shavings near the dying fire. From her traveling case, she withdrew a small tin pot and a packet of coffee grounds her last. She'd worry about food tomorrow. Tonight, she needed warmth. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off precious little heat. Clara searched the wood pile for smaller pieces, kindling that might catch quickly. Her hands, once so steady when suturing wounds by candlelight, shook slightly as she arranged the wood, not from cold alone, but from the weight of her situation settling onto her shoulders like a yoke. She'd left nothing behind in Kansas City except a rented room and a reputation for being difficult. Too tall, too plain, too direct in her speech, too marked by what she'd seen and done during the war. The proper ladies of Kansas City society had made it clear that a woman who'd spent 2 years up to her elbows in blood and gunpowder would never fit into their parlor conversations about propriety and Christian virtue. The kindling caught, sending up a small flame. Clara fed it carefully, the way she'd learned to do during those long nights in field hospitals, when maintaining a fire might mean the difference between a soldier living through the night or succumbing to shock. She didn't cry. She'd lost the knack for it somewhere between Veracruz and Mexico City, between the first amputation she'd assisted with and the last boy who'd died calling for his mother. Instead, she pulled her coat tighter, extended her hands toward the meager warmth, and began to plan. Tomorrow she would seek employment. She could sew. She'd mended enough uniforms and sutured enough wounds to know her way around a needle. She could cook, clean, tend the sick. She could read and write and figure numbers. Surely someone in this frontier town could use such skills. The fire crackled softly, pushing back the darkness in a small circle of light. Clara allowed herself one moment of despair, one brief acknowledgement of how far she'd fallen from the idealistic young woman who'd volunteered to serve her country. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and stared into the flames. She'd survived worse than this. She'd survive again. The saloon noise ebbed and flowed like a tide. Occasionally, a drunk would stumble out the back door to relieve himself, but none ventured near the woodshed. Clara remained motionless during these intrusions, a skill learned in territories where Confederate scouts might pass within feet of hidden Union positions. The night deepened, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep through the very ground. Clara's small fire fought valiantly against it, but she knew she'd need more wood soon. She was just reaching for another piece when a shadow fell across the entrance to the shed. A man stood there, tall enough that he had to duck slightly to see inside. The firelight caught the planes of his face, weathered, angular, with eyes that reflected the flames like a wolf's. He didn't speak, didn't move to enter. He simply observed her with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to reading the land and everything on it. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her traveling case, where she kept a small knife. Not much of a weapon, but she'd learned that sometimes the appearance of willingness to fight was enough. But the man made no threatening moves. Instead, he turned his attention to the dying fire, studying it with the same quiet intensity. Then, without a word, he moved into the shed with surprising grace for his size. Clara tensed, ready to flee or fight, but he simply selected several pieces of wood from the pile good. Dry hardwood that would burn long and hot and knelt by her small fire. His movements were economical, practiced. He built up the fire with the patience of someone who understood that rushing would only smother the flames. Neither spoke. The only sounds were the crack of catching wood and the distant piano from the saloon. When the fire was burning steadily, throwing real heat for the first time all evening, the man sat back on his heels and finally looked at her directly. "That should hold till morning," he said. His voice was low, roughened by weather or tobacco or both. Clara found her own voice. "Thank you." The words came out steadier than she felt. He nodded once, then rose to his feet in one fluid motion. At the entrance to the shed, he paused without turning back. "There's an empty cabin behind the livery stable. Dirt floor, but the roof's sound. Old man Peterson, who used to bunk there, died last month. No one's laid claim to it yet." Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness as quietly as he'd appeared. Clara stared after him, then at the fire now burning bright and strong. She'd encountered kindness before, but rarely so unadorned with expectation or explanation. In her experience, men who helped strange women always wanted something: gratitude, companionship, or worse. But this man had asked for nothing, hadn't even offered his name. She sat by the rebuilt fire until the coldest part of the night had passed, then gathered her belongings. The cabin behind the livery stable wasn't hard to find: a small, square structure that smelled of horses and old leather. As promised, The roof was sound, and someone had even left a pile of straw that could serve as bedding. Clara set her trunk in the corner and surveyed her new shelter. It wasn't much, but it was better than the woodshed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight she had a roof over her head and the memory of a stranger's unexpected kindness. She spread her coat over the straw and lay down fully clothed. Through a gap in the wallboards, she could see stars, the same stars that had watched over her in field hospitals and on desperate journeys. The same stars that would watch over her tomorrow. For the first time since leaving Kansas City, Clara Bennett allowed herself to hope that she might find a place in this rough frontier town. Not the place she'd expected, perhaps, but a place nonetheless. The wind sang through the gaps in the walls, but it no longer sounded quite so cold. Samuel McRae had been watching the woman by the fire for a good 10 minutes before he made his presence known. It was a habit born of years working cattle and horses. Observe first, understand the situation, then act. What he saw was a woman who held herself like a soldier, spine straight despite exhaustion, hands steady despite the cold. Not the usual type to wash up in Red Hollow. He'd been checking on the horses at the livery when he'd noticed the glow from Murphy's woodshed. His first thought was that some drunk had knocked over a lamp, but the light was too steady, too carefully contained. Curiosity and caution in equal measure had drawn him closer. Now, walking back to his own quarters above the stable, Samuel found himself thinking about those hands. They'd been reddened by cold but unmarked by the usual signs of frontier labor. Yet they'd handled the fire with practiced efficiency, the movements of someone who understood necessity over comfort. He'd seen plenty of women arrive in Red Hollow with grand plans and soft hands. Most lasted a season before heading back east or marrying the first man who offered security. This one, though she had the look of someone who'd already been burned down to bedrock and survived. Samuel paused at the door to the livery, looking back toward the abandoned cabin. He'd spoken true about Peterson's old place, though he hadn't mentioned the man had drunk himself to death after losing his claim to bad cards. The cabin was sound enough, but come morning, she'd need more than 4 walls to survive in Red Hollow. Inside the stable, horses shifted and nickered softly in their stalls. Samuel moved among them with the unconscious ease of a man more comfortable with animals than people. His own horse, a rangy bay gelding named Dust, pushed his nose against Samuel's shoulder in greeting. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, running a hand along the horse's neck. "Just checking on things." He'd come to Red Hollow 3 years ago, hiring on at the Broken Creek Ranch during spring roundup and staying through the seasons that followed. The ranch work suited him: long days in the saddle, nights under open sky, minimal need for conversation. When winter made ranch work scarce, he picked up jobs at the livery, mending tack and caring for the horses of travelers and townspeople alike. He climbed the ladder to his loft room, a sparse space containing little more than a narrow bed, a trunk, and a small stove. From the single window, he could see the dark outline of Peterson's cabin. No light showed she must have bedded down for the night. Samuel pulled off his boots and stretched out on the bed, hands behind his head. He'd learned long ago not to involve himself in other people's troubles. The war had taught him that lesson in blood and gunpowder, though he'd worn gray instead of blue. But something about the woman's dignified desperation had moved him to speak. He'd seen that particular kind of aloneness before, in soldiers cut off from their units, in settlers who'd lost everything to raids or weather. It was the aloneness of someone who'd gone too far to turn back, even if there was anything to return to. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the familiar sounds of the stable below and the less familiar tug of concern for a stranger. Morning arrived with frost on the windows and his breath visible in the cold air. Samuel rose, built up the fire in his small stove, and set coffee to boil. Through the window, he watched the town come slowly to life. Smoke began rising from chimneys, and early risers moved along the streets with the hunched urgency of people trying to get their business done before the worst heat of the day. He was just pouring his second cup when he saw her emerge from Peterson's cabin. In daylight, She was taller than he'd realized, nearly matching his own height. She moved with purpose toward the pump behind the livery, where she washed her face and hands with quick efficiency. The morning sun caught the auburn in her dark hair, which she'd pinned up in a severe style that did nothing to soften the strong lines of her face. Not pretty, most would say, but there was something compelling in the way she carried herself, as if she'd decided long ago that the world's opinion was a burden she wouldn't bear. Samuel found himself pulling on his boots and descending the ladder before he'd quite decided to do so. She was attempting to prime the stubborn pump when he approached, putting her shoulder into it with determination, but little effect. "Leather's dried out," he said by way of greeting. "Takes a particular touch." She stepped back without comment, watching as he worked the handle with a specific rhythm until water began to flow. He filled her small pot, then stepped back to give her room at the pump. "Thank you," she said, the same steady tone as the night before. "Mr.
McRae, Samuel McRae." He touched the brim of his hat slightly. "I work the horses here, and out at Broken Creek when they need hands."
"Clara Bennett." She didn't offer her hand, which saved him the awkwardness of deciding whether to take it. "I'm seeking employment. Perhaps you might know who's hiring." Samuel considered. "Depends what kind of work you're after, Mrs. Haywood at the Mercantile mentioned needing help, though she's particular about who she hires. The hotel might need chambermaids, and there's always washing and mending to be done for the single men." "I can sew," Clara said. "I have experience with—" She paused almost imperceptibly. "Detailed needlework." Something in the way she said it made Samuel look at her more closely. There were depths there, stories she wasn't telling. But then, everyone in Red Hollow had stories they kept to themselves. "There's a seamstress on 2nd Street, Mrs. Chen. She doesn't get much business from the proper ladies on account of being Chinese, but she does good work. Might be she could use help." Clara's expression didn't change, but he sensed approval in her stillness. Not many would consider working for a Chinese woman, but she didn't seem the type to let such concerns trouble her. "I'll seek her out." Clara said, "Thank you for the information." She turned to go, then paused. "The cabin is their rent to be paid." "Not to me. Town council might have something to say eventually, but they're usually too busy arguing about cattle regulations to notice one empty cabin. I'd say you have a few weeks before anyone makes a fuss." She nodded once, then walked away with that same measured stride. Samuel watched her go, noting the careful mending on her coat, the worn but well-maintained boots, a woman holding herself together by will and thread. He spent the morning working through his usual tasks, mucking stalls, checking hooves, mending a broken harness. But his mind kept returning to Clara Bennett and her careful words about needlework. He'd wager his best saddle she'd meant surgical needlework, the kind learned in field hospitals and emergency stations. Around midday, old Thomas Cray brought in a mare with a deep gash on her flank, courtesy of a run-in with barbed wire. "Can you stitch her up?" Cray asked, spitting tobacco juice into the sawdust. "Doc Harmon's out at the Johnson place with a birthing. Won't be back till tomorrow." Samuel examined the wound. It needed stitching. True enough. But his hands weren't made for fine work. He'd seen too many horses ruined by poor doctoring to attempt it himself. "Wait here," he told Cray. He found Clara at the pump again, washing what looked like ink from her fingers. Her face was composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of disappointment. Mrs. Chen wasn't hiring," he guessed. "She was kind," Clara said carefully. "But business is slow. She suggested I try the hotel after all." Samuel made a decision. "Can you stitch up a horse?" Her hands stilled on the towel. "I beg your pardon." "Mare with a wire cut. Needs stitching. Doc's away, and my hands aren't suited for it. Pays $2 if the job's done right." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the offer, calculating risks and benefits. "I'll need to see the wound first, and proper supplies." "Got everything in the tackle room," Cray's good for the money he set store by that mare." Without another word, she followed him back to the stable. Cray looked skeptical when Samuel introduced her, but his doubts faded as he watched Clara examine the wound with professional efficiency. "I'll need hot water," she said. "Carbolic if you have it, or whiskey if you don't. Clean cloths, a curved needle, and silk thread if available. Cotton if not." Samuel fetched the supplies while she spoke quietly to the mare, her hands running along the animal's neck with surprising gentleness. When he returned, she'd already begun cleaning the wound area, her movements sure and practiced. "Hold her head," she instructed Cray. "Mr. McRae, I'll need you to keep pressure here while I work." What followed was 15 minutes of precise, efficient surgery. Clara's hands never trembled, never hesitated. She sutured the wound in neat, even stitches that would have done credit to any doctor. When she finished, she applied a clean dressing and stepped back. "Keep it clean and dry," she told Cray. "Change the dressing daily. If you see signs of festering unusual heat, swelling, or discharge, send for me immediately." Cray examined her work with growing approval. "That's as fine a job as Doc Harmon himself could do. Maybe better." He pulled out his wallet and handed her $2 silver. "Mare's worth 10 times that to me. You ever need work, ma'am, you come see me first." After he'd led the mare away, Clara stood in the stable, looking at the coins in her hand as if they were foreign objects. "Thank you," she said to Samuel, "for thinking of me." "Seemed a waste," he said, "having skills like that and washing other people's undergarments." A smile almost touched her lips. Yes, it would be. That afternoon, word spread as word always did in small towns. The tall woman staying in Peterson's cabin could doctor animals as well as any veterinarian. By evening, she'd treated a dog with a torn ear, a milk cow with an infected hoof, and a prize rooster with a damaged wing. Samuel watched from the stable door as she worked, noting how she never flinched from the dirty work, never complained about the smell or the difficult customers. She treated each animal with the same careful attention, whether it belonged to the bank president or the Mexican family who lived by the creek. As darkness fell, she appeared at the stable door, looking tired but satisfied. In her hand was a small bundle, payment in food rather than coin from those who had little money to spare. "Eventful first day," Samuel observed. "More eventful than expected," she agreed. "I should thank you again. Without your recommendation, I'd still be seeking work. Town needed someone with your skills. Just made the connection." She studied him in the lamplight. "Why did you make the connection? I mean, you don't know me." Samuel considered the question. Why had he involved himself? He who'd spent 3 years avoiding entanglements, keeping to his horses in his solitary loft. "Knew someone like you once," he said finally. "Back in the war. Nurse who could set a bone or stitch a wound better than any field surgeon. Saved my brother's life after Chickamauga." He paused. Seemed wrong. Someone with those skills washing sheets for a living. She absorbed this information silently, and he appreciated that she didn't push for more details. The war was a wound that hadn't healed for most who'd lived through it, regardless of which side they'd served. "Well," she said at last, "I'm grateful. Whatever your reasons." She turned to go, then looked back. "Your brother, did he make it home?" "No," Samuel said quietly. "Fever took him 3 weeks later, but he had those 3 weeks because of someone like you." Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then she walked away toward Peterson's cabin, carrying her small bundle of food and the weight of shared loss. Samuel climbed back to his loft and sat by the window, watching as a small light appeared in the cabin. She'd bought or bartered for a candle. Then, good. The nights were too dark for someone used to sleeping under different stars. He thought about his brother James, dead these 15 years but still vivid in memory. About the nurse who'd worked through the night to save boys in blue and gray alike, making no distinction in their suffering. About the way some people carried their competence like armor, protecting a softer core within. Tomorrow, Clara Bennett would face new challenges. Word of her skill would spread, bringing more opportunities, but also more scrutiny. Red Hollow didn't always know what to do with capable women who didn't fit the usual patterns. But tonight, she had a roof over her head, food for her supper, and work that used her true skills. It was a start. Samuel pulled off his boots and prepared for bed, the sounds of settling horses below providing familiar comfort. Through the window, the light in Peterson's cabin burned steadily on, a small beacon of persistence in the prairie darkness. He found himself hoping it would still be burning come morning. The sewing shop on 2nd Street occupied a narrow building squeezed between the barber shop and a shuttered law office. Clara stood before it in the early morning light, reading the simple sign, Chen's Tailoring and Mending. Through the window, she could see neat rows of fabric and a woman bent over a sewing machine. She knocked and entered, a small bell announcing her arrival. Mrs. Chen looked up, a woman perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through her black hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Chen, my name is Clara Bennett. Mr. McRae suggested I speak with you about employment. The seamstress set aside her work. The tall woman who doctors animals. Word travels fast in Red Hollow. Her English carried only a slight accent. I told you yesterday I have no need for help. You did, Clara agreed. But perhaps we might discuss a different arrangement. Over the next half hour, Clara proposed a partnership of sorts. She would take in mending and basic alterations, working from Peterson's cabin, and bring Mrs. Chen the more complex work, fine dresses, men's suits, anything requiring the sewing machine or specialized skills. They would split the profits accordingly. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When Clara finished, she said, "The proper ladies won't give their fine work to someone living in Peterson's cabin." No, Clara agreed. But their husbands might give me their everyday mending. And the working women, the laundresses, the hotel maids, the Mexican families by the creek, they need sturdy clothes kept in good repair. You've thought this through. I've had time to think. Mrs. Chen stood and moved to the window, looking out at the slowly wakening street. My husband brought me here 15 years ago. Gold fever. He died in a mine collapse the second winter. Left me with 2 small children and a talent for sewing. She turned back to Clara. The proper ladies started coming to me only when Mrs. Larkin, the other seamstress, moved back east. Necessity overcame prejudice, but barely. Clara waited, recognizing the weight of the story being shared. Very well. Mrs. Chen said finally, "We try your arrangement for 1 month. You bring me what you cannot handle. I give you the simple work I have no time for. We see how it goes." They shook hands, 2 women who understood the mathematics of survival. Clara spent the rest of the morning spreading word of her services. She visited the hotel, the boarding houses, the saloons, anywhere working people might need clothes mended. By afternoon, she had a small pile of work-torn shirts, stockings with holes, a coat with a ripped lining. She carried her bounty back to Peterson's cabin and set up her workspace. Someone she suspected, Samuel, had left a wooden crate by her door that served as a table. She placed her sewing basket on it and got to work. The familiar rhythm of a needle through fabric calmed her mind. This was different from the urgent stitching of flesh, the race against blood loss and infection. This was peaceful, meditative. She could take her time, make tiny even stitches that would hold through countless washings. A shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up to find a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, watching her with solemn dark eyes. "Hello," Clara said. The girl didn't respond, but stepped closer, fascinated by the movement of the needle. Her dress was clean, but patched in several places, the patches sewn with more enthusiasm than skill. "Would you like to see?" Clara asked, holding up the shirt she was mending. The girl nodded and came to stand beside her. Up close, Clara could see the careful darning on her stockings, the way her two short sleeves had been lengthened with strips of different fabric. Someone was trying very hard to keep this child presentable. "I'm Clara. What's your name?" "Rosita." The voice was barely above a whisper. "That's a pretty name. Do you live near here?" Rosita pointed toward the creek, with Mama and Papa and baby Carlos. Clara continued sewing, letting the child watch. After a few minutes, Rosita asked, "Can you teach me to sew?" Clara considered. "If your mother agrees, yes." A woman's voice called out in Spanish, and Rosita's eyes widened. "I have to go." She darted away like a startled rabbit. Clara watched her go, remembering her own childhood fascination with her mother's needlework. Her mother, dead these 10 years, who'd taught her that straight seams and even stitches were marks of character as much as skill. The afternoon brought more customers. Some left coins. Others promised payment when they collected their mending. One old man offered a sack of beans and a chunk of bacon, which Clara accepted gladly. Currency took many forms on the frontier. As the sun began to sink, she looked up from her work to find Samuel McRae standing nearby, holding something wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering the package. Inside was a lamp not new, but clean and functional, with a full reservoir of oil. "I can't," Clara began. "It was Peterson's. Been sitting in the tack room gathering dust. Seems fitting it should light his cabin again." She wanted to refuse, but practicality won. Winter days were short, and sewing by candlelight would ruin her eyes. "Thank you. I'll repay you when—" "No need." He cut her off with a gesture. "Call it an investment in the town's new seamstress." He turned to go, then paused. "That girl earlier, Rosita Vargas. Her father works seasonally at the ranches. Good man, but work's been scarce. The mother takes in washing when she can." Clara understood the unspoken message. Perhaps Mrs. Vargas would trade washing for sewing lessons for her daughter. Perhaps she would. After he left, Clara lit the lamp and returned to her work. The steady light transformed the small cabin, making it feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a workspace, possibly even a home. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a woman her own age, well-dressed but harried, holding a bundle of cloth. "Miss Bennett, I'm Mrs. Thornton. My husband runs the bank." She spoke in a rush, as if afraid of being seen. "I have a rather urgent request." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal an elegant blue dress with a badly torn bodice. "I had an accident, caught it on a nail. The church social is tomorrow evening, and this is my best dress. Mrs. Chen is closed, and I didn't know where else." Clara examined the damage. It would require delicate work to make the repair invisible, but it could be done. "I can fix this. It will be ready by tomorrow afternoon." Mrs. Thornton's relief was palpable. "Oh, thank you. I'll pay whatever—" $2, Clara said, knowing it was half what Mrs. Chen would charge but twice what she'd get from the working families. After Mrs. Thornton left, Clara set aside the simpler mending and focused on the dress. The fabric was fine wool, the color of prairie sky just after sunset. As she worked, she wondered about the accident that had torn it so precisely along the seam, but she'd learned long ago not to question the stories people told about their misfortunes. The next morning brought more work and an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Vargas appeared at her door, Rosita hiding behind her skirts. "Señorita Bennett," she began in careful English. "My Rosita. She says you will teach her to sew. If you approve." Clara said, "Perhaps we could make an arrangement. Rosita could come twice a week for lessons. And in exchange, I do your washing." Mrs. Vargas finished, pride and practicality warring in her expression. "Yes, this is good." They agreed on Tuesdays and Thursdays after school. Rosita beamed, and Clara felt an unexpected warmth at the child's joy. Word of her repair of Mrs. Thornton's dress spread quickly. By evening, she had requests from 3 more of the town's proper ladies, all with urgent mending needs and all willing to pay well for discretion and quality. Clara worked late into the night, the lamp Samuel had given her casting steady light on her careful stitches. Her fingers moved automatically, leaving her mind free to wander. She thought about the strange turns that had brought her here, from battlefield hospitals to frontier cabin, from suturing wounds to mending clothes. There was something almost musical in the rhythm of the work, in the whisper of thread through fabric. She'd forgotten this peace, this sense of creating order from chaos, one stitch at a time. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. She opened the door to find Mrs. Chen holding a small pot of tea. "I saw your light," the seamstress said. "Thought you might need this." Clara invited her in, clearing a space on the crate table. They sat on upturned buckets, sharing tea from Clara's 2 cups. "So, Mrs. Thornton's dress." "Mrs." Chen observed, eyeing the blue fabric. "She comes to me for making, but perhaps not for mending anymore." "I'm sorry if—" "No." Mrs. Chen held up a hand. "Is good. I have more work than I can handle already. Better to share than to turn people away." She paused. "You did good work today, sending me Mr. Harrison for his new suit. He pays well and on time." They drank their tea in companionable silence. 2 women who understood the delicate balance of competition and cooperation. "Your husband," Clara ventured eventually. "You said he died in the mines." "Cave-in. They brought him home on a board." Mrs. Chen's voice was matter-of-fact, pain long since worn smooth. "I thought about going back to San Francisco, but where would I go? My family disowned me for marrying a gold seeker. His family never approved of a Chinese daughter-in-law." She shrugged. "So I stayed, made a place for myself with needle and thread." "And your children?" "My son works for the railroad, sends money when he can. My daughter married a shopkeeper in Denver." A small smile touched her lips. "She writes that I should come live with them, but this is my home now, my shop, my customers, my grave to tend on Sundays." Clara understood. Sometimes the place you ended up became home not through choice, but through the simple accumulation of days, each one adding another thin thread to the web that bound you. After Mrs. Chen left, Clara returned to her work. Tomorrow was Thursday, Rosita's first lesson. She would need to prepare something simple for small fingers to practice. Perhaps a sampler, like the one her own mother had started her on so many years ago. The lamp burned low as midnight approached. Clara added more oil and kept sewing. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The sound didn't frighten her. She'd heard worse sounds, seen worse things than anything the prairie night could offer. She finished Mrs. Thornton's dress and held it up to examine in the lamplight. The repair was invisible. The stitches so fine they seemed to merge with the original weave. It was good work. She knew. Work that would bring more customers, more requests, more coins and trade goods to keep her fed and sheltered through the winter. But as she folded the dress carefully and set it aside, Clara felt the weight of something more than simple satisfaction. For the first time in years, she was building something. Not just mending clothes, but creating connections with Mrs. Chen, with the Vargas family, even with the proper ladies who came to her door after dark. She thought of Samuel McRae, who'd opened these doors with his quiet suggestions and practical help, of his brother who'd died despite a nurse's best efforts, and of all the boys she'd tried to save who'd slipped away regardless. Some things couldn't be mended, no matter how skilled the hands that tried. But some things could: a torn dress, a child's eagerness to learn, a woman's determination to survive. Clara banked the lamp and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more small victories measured in straight seams and satisfied customers. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd left Kansas City. but it was a life nonetheless. Through the cabin's small window, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The same stars that had watched over her in field hospitals now watched over her in this small frontier town, constant in their distant light. She pulled her coat over the thin blanket she'd bought with yesterday's earnings and closed her eyes. In the morning, there would be dresses to mend and a little girl to teach and a place to continue building, one careful stitch at a time. For now, that was enough. Winter settled over Red Hollow like a gray wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. Clara had been in town nearly 2 months now, her small cabin becoming a familiar landmark for those seeking mending and medical care for their animals. The work kept her fed and warm, but December brought new challenges. The first hard freeze split the leather on her boots, and she spent an evening carefully stitching the cracks, knowing they wouldn't hold for long. Her coat, already thin when she'd arrived, now seemed to invite the cold rather than repel it. But new boots and a warmer coat would cost more than she could spare, even with her steady stream of customers. It was on such a morning, with frost thick on the windows and her breath clouding in the cabin air, that Samuel McRae appeared at her door. He carried an armload of split wood, though she hadn't asked for any. "Thought you might be running low," he said, stacking the wood neatly beside her small stove. Clara watched him work, noting how he never quite met her eyes. Over the weeks, this had become their pattern. He would appear with some necessity firewood, a bucket of fresh water when the pump froze, a haunch of venison when the hunting was good, always with a practical explanation that allowed her to accept without feeling beholden. "Your kindness is noted, Mr. McRae," she said, as she always did. "Just being neighborly," he replied, as he always did. But this morning, instead of leaving immediately, he lingered by the door. "There's talk of a dance at the church hall. Christmas social." Clara continued her sewing, though her fingers slowed. "I'm sure it will be well attended." "Folks are expected to go. All folks." He shifted his weight. "Might be you'd need something mended for it. Seems most of the town's been through your door for fixing up their Sunday best." I haven't given it much thought, which was true. She'd heard talk of the dance, but assumed such events weren't meant for women who lived in borrowed cabins and mended clothes for a living. Samuel pulled something from inside his coat, a folded length of fabric. "Found this in Peterson's trunk. His wife's, most likely, thought maybe—" He set it on her table and left before she could respond. Clara unfolded the fabric slowly. It was wool, a deep green that made her think of pine forests, though she'd only seen such things in pictures. Not new, but good quality, with only a few moth holes that could be easily hidden in the seams, enough to make a simple dress, if she was careful with the cutting. She ran her hand over the material, feeling its weight and warmth. It had been years since she'd had anything new, anything that wasn't practical and plain. The thought of making something just for herself felt almost foreign. A knock interrupted her musings. Mrs. Thornton stood at the door, no longer furtive but still careful about her visits. "Clara, dear," she began, having moved to first names after the successful repair of 3 more dresses. "I have a proposition for you." She entered and sat on the stool Clara offered, arranging her skirts carefully. "The church social is coming up, as you surely know. Several of us were discussing the decorations, and Mary Hartwell mentioned you'd done beautiful embroidery on her daughter's christening gown." Clara had indeed embellished the gown, adding delicate flowers around the hem when Mrs. Hartwell couldn't afford the expensive lace she'd wanted. "We'd like to commission you to help with the decorations, specifically table runners and perhaps some banners. We can provide the materials, and of course, we'll pay for your time." It was a significant offer. Church work meant visibility, respectability, a foot in the door of proper society. But Clara heard the unspoken expectation if she was working on decorations. She'd be expected to attend the social. "I'd be honored to help," she said carefully. "When would you need them completed?" 2 weeks should be sufficient. I'll have the materials sent over this afternoon. Mrs. Thornton rose to leave, then paused. You will be attending, won't you? It wouldn't do for the creator of our beautiful decorations to be absent. After she left, Clara looked again at the green fabric. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding in the shadows of respectability. She had work, a place in the community, even something approaching friendship with Mrs. Chen and the Vargas family. A dress for a church social seemed a small enough risk. That evening, after finishing her mending work, she laid out the fabric and began planning. The style would need to be simple. She had no sewing machine like Mrs. Chen, but she could add small touches that would make it special. Perhaps embroidery at the collar and cuffs, using the skills that had impressed Mrs. Thornton. As she worked, she became aware of music drifting from the saloon. Not the usual tinny piano, but a fiddle playing a slow, mournful tune that made her think of home, not Kansas City, but the home before that, when her parents were alive and the future seemed clear and bright. The music stopped, then started again, this time a livelier tune. Clara found herself humming along as she cut carefully around her paper pattern. She'd forgotten music could be something other than a marker of other people's joy, something observed from outside. The next morning brought Rosita for her sewing lesson. The girl had proven an eager student, her small fingers growing more confident with each session. Today they were working on hemming, a practical skill that would serve her well. Miss Clara, Rosita said as she worked, will you go to the Christmas dance? I'm thinking about it. Mama says she won't go because she has no pretty dress, but I told her pretty dresses aren't what makes a person good. From the mouths of children, Clara thought, your mama is lucky to have such a wise daughter. Will you make her a pretty dress? Clara considered. She'd been saving the small amount she could spare each week, but it would be months before she could afford new boots. Does your mama have an old dress she doesn't wear anymore? Rosita nodded enthusiastically. The blue one with the torn skirt. She says it's too damaged to fix. Bring it next time. We'll see what can be done. The girl beamed and returned to her hemming with renewed concentration. Clara watched her work, remembering her own mother's patience as she'd untangled countless failed attempts. Teaching Rosita had awakened something she'd thought lost the simple pleasure of passing on knowledge, of watching someone grow under her guidance. The church decoration materials arrived as promised, fine white cotton and colorful thread for embroidery. Clara spent the next days creating elegant table runners with twining vines and delicate flowers. The work was intricate, but soothing, each stitch adding to a pattern that grew beneath her hands like a garden in snow. Samuel continued his visits, always with some practical reason. One morning he arrived just as she was trying to hang the finished runners to press them. Let me help, he said, taking one end of the long fabric. They worked in comfortable silence, hanging each runner carefully. When they finished, the small cabin looked like it had been decorated for a celebration, white fabric bright against the rough wooden walls. Beautiful work, he said, and she heard genuine admiration in his voice. It's been a long time since I've done anything purely decorative. Clara admitted, there's something satisfying about creating beauty for its own sake. Not much call for beauty out here, Samuel said. Folks are too busy surviving. Perhaps that's when we need it most. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Perhaps you're right. After he left, Clara returned to work on her green dress. She'd decided on a simple design with a fitted bodice and full skirt, nothing as elaborate as what Mrs. Thornton and her circle would wear, but respectable and well-made. The embroidery at the collar depicted small pine cones and needles, a pattern she remembered from a book of her mother's. 3 days before the social, Mrs. Vargas arrived with Rosita and the promised blue dress. It was indeed badly damaged, with tears along the hem and bodice that had been clumsily mended. Is nothing to save, Mrs. Vargas said sadly. But Rosita insisted. Clara examined the dress carefully. The fabric was still good in many places, and the color, a soft blue like morning sky, was lovely. "I can work with this, but I'll need your measurements." Hope dawned in Mrs. Vargas's eyes. "You can truly fix." "Not fix, transform," Clara smiled. "Trust me." She spent that night and the next day rebuilding the dress, using the good portions of fabric to create something new. The torn bodice became a decorative panel down the front, edged with embroidery to hide the seams. The damaged skirt was recut into a more modern style that required less fabric. When she finished, it looked like a deliberately designed dress rather than a salvage project. "Mrs. Vargas cried when she saw it. "It's too beautiful. I cannot pay." "You already have," Clara said firmly. "Rosita's help with my mending has been payment enough." The night of the social arrived clear and cold, stars brilliant in the winter sky. Clara dressed carefully in her new green dress, her hair pinned up more softly than usual. Looking in the small mirror she'd bought from the general store, she hardly recognized herself. Not beautiful, perhaps, but presentable, respectable. The church hall blazed with light, her white runners gracing tables laden with food and punch. The sound of fiddle and guitar spilled out into the night, along with laughter and conversation. Clara hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of her solitary status. Most women would arrive with families or husbands, not alone with calloused hands and memories of battlefield hospitals. "Miss Clara?" Rosita appeared at her side, resplendent in a red dress that had clearly been enhanced with her new hemming skills. "You came." Mrs. Vargas followed, looking radiant in the transformed blue dress. "Miss Bennett," she said formally, then broke into a smile. "You look very fine." They entered together, the three of them, and Clara felt some of her anxiety ease. The hall was crowded with familiar faces, customers, neighbors, people whose clothes she'd mended and animals she'd treated. Many nodded in greeting, and Mrs. Thornton actually crossed the room to compliment her on the decorations. Clara found a quiet corner where she could observe the festivities. Couples danced, children darted between adults' legs, and the older folks clustered near the food tables, gossiping and laughing. It was a scene of simple community joy, the kind she'd watched from outside for so long. "Not dancing," Samuel's voice came from beside her. She turned to find him dressed in what must be his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark vest, and pants that showed only minimal wear. He'd made an effort, she realized, just as she had. "I'm not much for dancing," she said. "Neither am I." He stood beside her, watching the swirling couples. "But sometimes it's worth doing things we're not much for." Before she could respond, he held out his hand. "One dance, so folks won't talk about the seamstress who stands in corners." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, work-roughened like her own, steady and patient. She thought of all the small kindnesses he'd shown, all the practical help that had allowed her to maintain her pride while accepting assistance. "One dance," she agreed, placing her hand in his. He led her onto the floor just as the musicians began a slow waltz. Samuel danced like he did everything else with quiet competence and no wasted motion. Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm, remembering dance lessons from a lifetime ago when she'd been young and war was just a word in newspapers. "That's a fine dress," he said. "The color suits you." "Thank you for the fabric." Peterson would be glad to see it put to use. He was a practical man. They danced in silence then, but it was the comfortable silence she'd grown accustomed to with him. Around them, the community of Red Hollows celebrated the season, and for the first time, Clara felt herself part of it rather than simply observing. When the dance ended, Samuel led her back to her corner. "Thank you," he said simply, then disappeared into the crowd. Clara stayed another hour, accepting compliments on the decorations, discussing sewing projects with potential customers, even teaching Rosita and some other children a simple party game she remembered from childhood. When she finally made her farewells and stepped out into the cold night, she felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the heated hall. Walking home under the brilliant stars, Clara thought about transformations. Mrs. Vargas's dress, rebuilt from ruins, her own life, reshaped from the remnants of what had been. Even this rough frontier town, constantly remaking itself as people came and went, lived and died, built new lives from the pieces of old ones. She reached her cabin to find a small package on the doorstep. Inside was a pair of thick wool socks, hand-knitted and still smelling faintly of lanolin. No note, but she recognized the careful workmanship old Mrs. Kramer, whose husband's shirts Clara mended without charging because she knew they had little money. Clara held the socks, feeling their warmth and weight. Tomorrow she would return to her needle and thread, to the constant work of mending and making do. But tonight, she had danced at a church social in a dress of forest green, had been part of the community instead of apart from it. She lit her lamp and sat by the stove, still wearing her good dress. From her sewing basket, she took out a small piece of leftover green fabric, without quite knowing why. She began embroidering it with tiny stitches, creating a pattern of stars like the ones overhead, a remembrance of this night when she'd stepped out of the shadows, when warm socks appeared on doorsteps and taciturn horsemen asked lonely seamstresses to dance. The fire crackled in the stove, the lamp cast its steady light, and Clara's needle moved in its ancient rhythm. Outside, Red Hollow settled into winter quiet, but inside the borrowed cabin, warmth bloomed like an unexpected flower in the snow. The blizzard struck 2 weeks after the Christmas social, arriving with the sudden violence of a cavalry charge. Clara woke to wind that screamed like wounded soldiers and snow that turned the world white and formless. By noon, drifts had piled against her door, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped until her breath clouded with each exhalation. She'd weathered storms before, but always with adequate supplies and shelter. Now she took inventory with growing concern: firewood for perhaps 2 days if she was careful, flour for a few simple meals, a dwindling supply of coffee. The lamp oil was nearly gone, and her small stove struggled against the cold that seeped through every gap in the walls. By the second day, ice had formed on the inside of the windows. Clara wore every piece of clothing she owned, layers upon layers, but still the cold penetrated. She kept her hands moving, sewing by the dim light that filtered through the frost-covered glass, knowing that stillness invited a deeper chill. On the third night, her firewood ran out. She burned what she could: scraps of wood from Peterson's abandoned furniture, even some old newspapers she'd been saving. But paper burned too quickly, and the furniture pieces were too large for her small stove without an axe to split them. The temperature continued to drop. Clara had seen men freeze to death during the war, had watched the particular stillness that overtook them as cold claimed their bodies. She recognized the early signs in herself, the trembling that came in waves, the drowsiness that tempted her to stop fighting. She kept moving, pacing the small cabin, swinging her arms to force blood into her fingertips. Near midnight, she heard something above the wind's howl, a pounding, rhythmic and insistent. The door was frozen shut, ice sealing it like a tomb, but the pounding continued until wood cracked and the door burst open. Samuel McRae stood in the doorway, covered in snow, his face raw from the wind. He took in the dark stove, her huddled form, the ice on the walls, and moved with swift purpose. "Can you walk?" His voice was rough with cold and something else: anger, perhaps, or fear. "Of course I can walk," Clara said, though her legs betrayed her with their stiffness. Without asking permission, he wrapped his heavy coat around her, then lifted her bodily when she struggled to move quickly enough. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, carrying her out into the storm. The journey to the livery stable seemed endless, though it could only have been 100 yards. Snow blinded them. Wind tried to tear them apart, but Samuel moved with the certainty of a man who'd walked this path 1,000 times. Clara buried her face against his shoulder. Past pride, past propriety. Focused only on the warmth that radiated from him despite the cold. His room above the stable was small but warm, heated by a proper iron stove that glowed red with banked coals. He set her down near it, then immediately began adding wood, building the fire higher. "Your feet," he said tersely. "Boots off." Clara fumbled with the laces, her fingers too numb to work properly. Samuel knelt and unlaced them himself, his own hands shaking slightly. Her feet were white with cold, and he sucked in a breath. "This will hurt," he warned, then began rubbing them gently, bringing circulation back. It did hurt, like needles of fire, but Clara had endured worse. She focused on the room around her, sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a table and chair, and shelves holding a few books. Everything neat and ordered, like the man himself. "How did you know?" she asked, when she could speak without her teeth chattering. "Saw your chimney wasn't smoking this morning. Figured you were low on wood. Then, when the worst of it hit tonight—" He didn't finish, but she heard what he didn't say. He'd risked the storm because he'd known she was in trouble. He made coffee, strong and black, and insisted she drink it all. Then he handed her thick wool socks and a blanket. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks, we'll see about getting you supplied properly." "I can't," Clara began, but he cut her off with a look. "You can and you will. I'll bed down in the hayloft. It's warm enough with the horses below." He moved toward the door, then paused. "That pride of yours nearly killed you tonight." After he left, Clara sat by the stove, feeling life return to her extremities. The room was basic but held small touches of unexpected comfort. A quilt that looked handmade, a daguerreotype of a young couple on the shelf, fresh coffee in the tin. This was Samuel's private space, and he'd given it to her without hesitation. She thought about pride, about the walls she'd built to protect herself from pity and charity. Those walls had served her well in Kansas City, where accepting help often came with obligations she couldn't meet. But here, in this frontier town where survival often depended on community, perhaps those walls had become a prison. The storm raged for 2 more days. Samuel appeared periodically to tend the fire and bring food, simple fare of beans and cornbread, but hot and filling. They spoke little during these visits, but an understanding grew between them, built on shared silence and small gestures. On the second night, he stayed longer, accepting her offer to share the coffee she'd made. "The couple in the picture," she ventured. "Your parents?" He nodded. "Taken on their wedding day. They had a farm in Missouri before the war." "Had?" "Burned. Neighbor turned them in for harboring Confederate sympathizers." His voice held old pain, scarred over but still tender. "They weren't, but truth didn't matter much in those days." Clara understood. The war had made truth a casualty long before the first shot was fired. "Where did they go?" "Nowhere. They were in the barn when it burned." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Clara reached across the small table and touched his hand briefly. Not a comfort, exactly, but an acknowledgement of shared understanding. "Is that why you came west?" "Part of it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Nothing left there. Farm gone, family gone. Seemed like staying would be living in a grave. They sat quietly then. 2 people who'd lost their original lives to violence and circumstance, who'd traveled west not seeking fortune but escape from memories that followed like shadows. When the storm finally broke, the world had been transformed. Snow lay feet deep, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The sun emerged fierce and brilliant, turning everything to crystal and diamond. Samuel and Clara worked together to dig a path to her cabin. What they found there sobered them both. The stovepipe had frozen solid, ice coated everything, and the cold had split what little firewood remained. "You can't stay here," Samuel said flatly. "Not until spring. Anyway." Clara wanted to argue, but couldn't. The evidence was too clear. Her pride had nearly cost her life, and only his intervention had prevented it. Mrs. Chen has a room above her shop," she said finally. "She mentioned possibly renting it." "Good. I'll help you move your things." They worked in companionable efficiency, packing her sewing supplies, her few possessions. Samuel insisted on carrying the heaviest items, and Clara found herself accepting the help without protest. Perhaps this too was a kind of strength, knowing when to bend rather than break. Mrs. Chen welcomed her warmly, showing her the small but clean room above the shop. It had a proper stove, windows that closed tight, and proximity to the main part of town. The rent was reasonable, and included use of the shop's sewing machine for her work. "It's good you come here," Mrs. Chen said. "Pride makes cold companion in winter." That evening, as Clara arranged her belongings in the new room, she found Samuel had left something on her table, a pair of fur-lined gloves, clearly old but well-maintained. She sought him out at the stable, finding him mending harness by lamplight. "The gloves," she began. "Were my mother's," he said without looking up. "Been sitting in that trunk for 3 years. Seems foolish, keeping things that aren't used." Clara pulled on the gloves, feeling the soft fur against her skin. They fit perfectly. "Thank you." He did look up then. "You scared me," he said simply. "When I saw that dark chimney, no smoke. Don't do that again." "I won't," she promised, and meant it. That night, warm in her new room, Clara reflected on the strange turns of the past days. She'd nearly died from cold and pride, been rescued by a man who asked nothing in return, and found herself part of a community that watched out for its own. She thought about Samuel carrying her through the storm, about Mrs. Chen's matter-of-fact kindness, about all the small connections she'd built in this unlikely place. Her fingers found the gloves, traced the careful stitching that had held them together all these years. In the morning, she would return to her sewing, to her place in the life of Red Hollow. But something had shifted during the storm. The walls she'd built for protection had cracks now, places where warmth could enter, where connection could grow. Through her window, she could see the livery stable, a lamp still burning in the upper window. She wondered if Samuel was reading one of those books on his shelf, or perhaps mending more harness, finding peace in the simple rhythm of necessary work. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world clean and new. And in its wake, Clara Bennett found herself no longer quite so alone, no longer quite so defended against the kindness of others. It was a different kind of survival, perhaps one that acknowledged that even the strongest sometimes needed shelter from the storm. She pulled the warm quilts up to her chin, safe in her new room, and slept without dreams of cold or soldiers or the terrible price of pride. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently this time, like a benediction on the sleeping town. Spring came slowly to Red Hollow, arriving in fits and starts like an uncertain visitor. By late March, the snow had melted into mud, and the first green shoots pushed through the brown earth. Clara had settled into her room above Mrs. Chen's shop, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of work and the growing warmth of community. But comfort, she'd learned, was often followed by complications. It started with whispers at the general store, glances that lingered too long, and conversations that stopped when she approached. Clara had lived long enough to recognize the signs of gossip taking root, spreading through the town like wildfire through dry grass. The source became clear when Mrs. Hartwell, one of her regular customers, arrived for a fitting with pursed lips and disapproval radiating from every line of her body. "Miss Bennett," she began, emphasizing the "miss" with pointed precision. "There's been talk." Clara continued pinning the hem of Mrs. Hartwell's new skirt, keeping her expression neutral. "There often is. About you and Samuel McRae, about the storm, and where you spent those nights." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. Mr. McRae saved my life during the blizzard. He gave up his own room while he slept in the stable." "So you say?" Mrs. Hartwell sniffed. "But a single woman, spending nights unchaperoned with the bachelor people, are bound to assume." "That Christian charity still exists," Clara suggested mildly. Mrs. Hartwell's face reddened. "Don't be flippant. Miss Bennett, your reputation affects your business, and the ranch where he works might not want to employ a man of questionable character." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Clara sat at the sewing machine, her hands idle on the fabric. She'd known this would come eventually. A single woman in a frontier town walked a narrow path useful enough to be tolerated, but always one misstep away from scandal. Mrs. Chen found her there an hour later, still motionless. "You hear the talk?" the older woman asked. "Mrs. Hartwell was kind enough to inform me." Mrs. Chen made a dismissive sound. "Margaret Hartwell talks because her own life is empty. Her husband spends more time at the saloon than home." "That may be true, but talk can still do damage." "Yes," Mrs. Chen agreed. "But what damage you lose some customers. There are always others. They say you are fallen woman. You still sew better than anyone else in town." Clara smiled despite herself. "You make it sound simple." "Not simple, but not worth losing sleep." Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder. "Besides, Samuel McRae is good man. Worse things to be talked about with." That evening, Clara was closing the shop when Samuel appeared at the door. He looked tired, his clothes dustier than usual. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, noting the tension in his shoulders. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of gathering words. "You've heard the talk," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. It's affecting your business." "Some." She moved to the small stove where a pot of coffee stayed warm. Mrs. Hartwell made her feelings clear. "Ranch foreman heard it too. Suggested I might want to find work elsewhere if I couldn't manage my personal affairs better." Clara handed him a cup, anger flaring on his behalf. "That's unfair. You saved my life." "Fair doesn't count for much out here." He took a sip, grimacing at the bitter brew. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The "we" stopped her cold. She'd been thinking of this as her problem to solve, her reputation to protect, but of course it affected him too. "I could leave," she said quietly. "Find another town, start over." "No." The word came sharp and fast. "That's not... no." They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between them. Finally, Samuel set down his cup with careful precision. "There's another solution," he said, "one that would stop the talk." Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her voice steady. "And that would be marriage." He said it like he might say rain coming or horse needs shoeing, a simple statement of fact. Not a real, that is, a practical arrangement. For appearance, you could keep working, keep your room here if you prefer, but it would stop the gossip. Clara studied him. This man who offered marriage like he offered firewood as a solution to a practical problem. And what would you gain from such an arrangement? He shifted uncomfortably. "Ranch can't afford to lose me, not with spring roundup coming. If I had a wife, a respectable situation, the talk would die down." "A business arrangement, then, if that's how you want to see it." But Clara heard something else in his voice, saw something in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. This man who'd carried her through a blizzard, who left firewood at her door, who'd given her his mother's gloves, he was offering what he thought she'd accept, framing care as practicality. "I need to think," she said. He nodded, setting his hat back on his head. "Course you do. It's not a small thing." He moved to the door, then turned back. "Clara, Miss Bennett, I want you to know. Either way, I don't regret what I did. Keeping you alive matters more than what people say." After he left, Clara climbed to her room and sat by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Marriage as a practical arrangement wasn't uncommon on the frontier. Plenty of couples married for convenience, for protection, for the simple need to not face the wilderness alone. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether stepping forward meant flight or falling. She thought about her life these past months, the slow building of trust with the townspeople, the satisfaction of useful work, the quiet companionship of people like Mrs. Chen and Samuel. She'd built something here, fragile but real. Was she willing to risk it on the sharp tongues of gossips? But perhaps the real question was different. Was she willing to let Samuel risk his livelihood for her? He'd already given so much, asked for so little in return. Could she accept this last offering, even if it came disguised as practicality? The next morning brought Rosita for her lesson, chattering excitedly about the new calf at their homestead. But she grew quiet when Clara seemed distracted. "Miss Clara, are you sad?" "No, dear, just thinking. Mama says thinking too hard makes wrinkles." Rosita studied her seriously. "You don't have wrinkles yet." "Despite everything?" Clara laughed. "Then I'd better stop thinking so hard." "Mr. Samuel doesn't have wrinkles either," Rosita added innocently. "Even though he thinks hard too. I see him sometimes, watching you when he thinks nobody's looking." Children saw everything, Clara reflected, often more clearly than adults. That afternoon, she sought out Mrs. Chen in the shop below. "If I were to marry," she began without preamble, "could I still work here?" Mrs. Chen looked up from her sewing machine. "You thinking of marrying?" "It's been suggested as a practical measure." "Ah," Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. Samuel McRae finally spoke up. "You knew—" "Everyone knows, except maybe you two. Man doesn't risk his life in a blizzard for just anybody." She returned to her sewing. "You can always work here, married, single. Makes no difference to me." Clara spent the rest of the day in a haze of routine tasks, her mind circling the decision. That evening, she walked to the livery stable, finding Samuel working by lantern light, mending a broken bridle. "I've thought about your proposal," she said without preamble. He set down the leather, giving her his full attention. "I have conditions," she continued. "I keep working, I maintain my own finances, and we're honest with each other, no pretending this is something it's not." Agreed. He stood slowly. "I have one condition too, which is, we try to make it real, not just for show, but a real partnership. I'm tired of being alone. Clara, and I think maybe you are too." The honesty of it took her breath away. She'd expected continued pretense, careful distance. Instead, he offered truth. "Yes," she said softly. "I think I am." They were married 3 weeks later in the church, with Mrs. Chen and the Vargas family as witnesses. Clara wore her green dress from the Christmas social, with the new embroidery at the hem. Samuel wore his Sunday best, his face grave but his eyes warm when he looked at her. The ceremony was simple. The reception, modest coffee and cake in the church hall, attended by those who'd become their quiet supporters. Mrs. Thornton was conspicuously absent, but many others came, offering congratulations that seemed genuine. That evening, they stood awkwardly in Samuel's room above the stable, now their room, though Clara had moved only a few possessions from Mrs. Chen's. "I thought I'd keep a cot in the tack room," Samuel offered. Unless you decide different." Clara looked around the small space, neat and sparse as always. Through the window, she could see the lights of Red Hollow, the town that had become home despite her best efforts to remain separate. "That seems sensible," she agreed. Then, surprising herself, "But perhaps we could have supper together in the evenings, if your work permits." "I'd like that." They shook hands then, Two people entering a partnership that was neither love match nor pure convenience, but something in between, a recognition of mutual need, mutual respect, and the possibility of something deeper, given time. The gossip died down. As Samuel had predicted, respectably married, Clara found her business actually increased. The scandal mongers moved on to other targets, and life in Red Hollow continued its rhythm of seasons and small dramas. But in the quiet evenings, when Samuel and Clara shared simple meals and conversation, when their silences grew comfortable and their glances held warmth, something else began to grow. Not the passionate love of dime novels, but something steadier, a foundation built on shared strength, trusted support, and the slow recognition that some of the best things in life arrive disguised as necessity. Summer arrived with its burden of heat and dust, turning the streets of Red Hollow into rivers of powder that coated everything with a fine brown film. Clara had been married to Samuel for 3 months now, a marriage that existed in the peculiar space between arrangement and affection, growing more real with each passing day. They'd settled into a rhythm. Samuel would rise before dawn for his work at the ranch, leaving coffee warming on the stove. Clara would spend her days at Mrs. Chen's shop, returning in the evening to prepare supper in their small room above the stable. They ate together when his work permitted, sharing the events of their days with increasing ease. But routine couldn't shield them from the growing tension in the town. It started with the miners' rough men who'd struck a small vein of silver in the hills and now spent their earnings freely in the saloons. Then came the cattlemen, driving herds through to the railroad terminus, their presence swelling the town's population and straining its limited resources. With them came trouble fights, theft, and a general lawlessness that Marshal Henderson seemed unable or unwilling to control. Clara first noticed the change when several of her regular customers stopped coming. Mrs. Vargas arrived one Tuesday without Rosita, her face tight with worry. "Where's our young seamstress?" Clara asked. "I keep her home now," Mrs. Vargas said quietly. "Is not safe. The streets. Those men, they say things, make gestures. Better she stays close." Clara felt anger kindle in her chest. Rosita loved her sewing lessons, looked forward to them all week. That fear should keep her away seemed a deep injustice. That evening, she spoke to Samuel about it as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "It's getting worse," he agreed. "Had to break up 2 fights at the stable today. Miners think they own the town now that they have silver in their pockets." "Can't the marshal do something?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Henderson's more interested in keeping the peace with whoever's paying. Right now, that's the mining company. So we just accept it. Let them drive decent people off the streets." Not much choice, but she heard the frustration in his voice, saw it in the tight set of his shoulders. The next week brought worse news. Mrs. Chen's shop window was broken by a drunk miner who took offense at her foreign ways. The man faced no consequences beyond a night in the jail to sober up. Clara helped clean up the glass, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. Mrs. Chen maintained her usual stoicism, but Clara saw the fear beneath it. "Maybe it's time to think about leaving," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "My daughter writes from Denver. Says I should come." "You can't leave. This is your home, your business." "Business is no good if I'm not alive to run it." That night, Clara couldn't settle to her sewing. She paced their small room until Samuel returned, later than usual and bearing a bruised cheek. "What happened?" "Nothing important." He moved to the wash basin, wincing as he cleaned the cut. "Samuel," he sighed. "Couple of miners decided they didn't need to pay for their horses' boarding. When I insisted, they took exception." Clara fetched her medical supplies, gently cleaning the wound despite his protests. As she worked, she felt something shift inside her, a movement from the careful distance of their arrangement toward something fiercer, more protective. "This can't continue," she said. "No," he agreed. "It can't." The breaking point came the following Saturday. Clara was returning from a house call she'd been treating the Hendricks milk cow when she heard shouting from the main street. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon, their voices ugly with mob excitement. Pushing through, she saw what had drawn them. 2 miners had cornered young Tom Vargas, Rosita's older brother. The boy, perhaps 14, stood with his back against the wall, trying to maintain dignity despite his fear. "Caught this little thief red-handed," one miner announced. "Reaching for my pocket, he was—" "I wasn't," Tom protested. "I was just walking by." The miner backhanded him casually, sending the boy sprawling. The crowd murmured, some in approval, others in discomfort, but no one moved to intervene. Clara pushed forward. "That's enough." The miner turned, taking in her height, her plain dress, her set jaw. "This ain't women's business, ma'am. Best move along." "Attacking children is everyone's business." She helped Tom to his feet, positioning herself between him and the miners. "Go home, Tom, go now." The boy hesitated, then ran. The miner stepped forward, face darkening. "You just helped a thief escape. Woman." "I helped a child get away from grown men who should be ashamed." Her voice carried clear across the crowd. "If you have accusations, take them to the marshal, though we all know what justice looks like in this town lately." The miner raised his hand, and Clara braced herself. But the blow never fell. Samuel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Touch her and you'll answer to me." He stood at the edge of the crowd, dusty from the road but radiating a quiet menace Clara had never seen before. The easygoing horseman was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. The miner laughed. "The stable boy wants to play hero. No playing involved." Samuel moved through the crowd, people parting before him. He stopped beside Clara, not touching her but close enough that she felt his warmth. Just a man protecting his wife. "Your wife should learn to mind her place." "Her place is wherever she chooses to stand." Samuel's voice remained level, but Clara saw his hand hover near his hip, where she knew he kept a knife. "Now you boys have had your fun. Time to move along." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke before a fire. Then the second miner tugged at his companion's sleeve. "Come on, Jake. Ain't worth the trouble." They retreated to the saloon, followed by most of the crowd. Samuel turned to Clara, his face a mask of controlled fear. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "But Tom—" "I saw him running home. He's safe." He took her arm gently. "Come on, let's get off the street." They walked back to the stable in silence, but Clara felt the tremor in his hand where it rested on her elbow. Inside their room, with the door closed against the world, Samuel sank onto a chair and put his head in his hands. "When I saw him raise his hand to you," his voice was rough, "I would have killed him. Clara, would have put him down like a rabid dog." She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. They were shaking. "But you didn't. You handled it with words, not violence." This time, he looked at her, and she saw the depth of his fear. "But what about next time? What happens when words aren't enough?" "Then we face it together." The simple declaration hung between them. Samuel studied her face, then slowly, carefully, pulled her into an embrace. It was the first time they'd held each other since their awkward wedding day, and Clara felt the rightness of it, the safety of his arms around her. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair. "Not when I'm just starting to find you." She pulled back to look at him. "You won't. We're stronger together than apart." That night, for the first time, Samuel didn't retreat to his cot in the tack room. They lay side by side in the narrow bed, fully clothed, hands clasped between them like a bridge across the careful distance they'd maintained. "We need to do something about the town," Clara said into the darkness. "Yes. The good people outnumber the troublemakers. They just need someone to rally them." Samuel squeezed her hand. "You're thinking of running for marshal yourself." "Despite everything," she smiled. "Can you imagine, though I'd likely do a better job than Henderson?" "You would." His voice held no humor, only conviction. "But there are other ways to fight." They talked long into the night, planning and plotting like generals before a battle. By dawn, they had the beginnings of a strategy not to fight the miners directly, but to organize the townspeople, to create a network of mutual protection and support. The next morning, Clara woke to find Samuel already up, making coffee. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers with new tenderness. "No backing down now," he warned. "Once we start this, we'll make enemies." "We already have enemies," Clara pointed out. "At least now we'll face them together." He smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Together, then." As Clara prepared for the day ahead, she reflected on the strange paths that had led them here. A practical marriage born of gossip and necessity had become something deeper, a partnership forged in shared purpose and growing affection. They might not have married for love, but love, it seemed, had found them anyway. The fight for Red Hollow's soul would be difficult, but standing beside Samuel, feeling the solid strength of their partnership, Clara believed they might just prevail. After all, they'd already overcome storms, both literal and metaphorical. What were a few rowdy miners compared to that? She pinned up her hair with extra care, donned her most respectable dress, and prepared to begin the quiet revolution that would either save their town or drive them from it. Either way, she wouldn't face it alone. Samuel waited by the door, hat in hand. "Ready?" "Ready." They stepped out into the morning sun, side by side, to begin the work of reclaiming their home. The accident happened on a blazing July afternoon when the heat shimmered off the hard-packed earth like water. Samuel had been working with a new string of horses brought in for breaking wild mustangs from the northern ranges, their eyes full of fire and fear. Clara was in the shop, teaching Rosita a new embroidery stitch, when young Pete Harmon burst through the door. "Mrs. McRae, come quick, it's your husband." The words she'd dreaded since their marriage froze her blood. She grabbed her medical bag, a habit from the war years, and ran. A crowd had gathered near the breaking corral. Through gaps between bodies, she glimpsed Samuel on the ground, terrifyingly still. Blood matted his hair, and his left leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. "Move aside!" Her battlefield voice cut through the murmuring crowd. People scattered, revealing the full extent of the damage. Samuel lay unconscious, thrown against the fence posts with brutal force. The stallion that had thrown him pranced nervously in the far corner, sides heaving. Clara knelt beside her husband, her hands moving with practiced efficiency even as her heart hammered. Head injury significant but not immediately fatal. Broken leg clean break below the knee. Possible internal injuries she'd need to monitor for signs. But he was breathing, his pulse steady if weak. "I need men to carry him. Carefully," she ordered. "4 of you. We're taking him to our room. Someone fetch Doctor Harmon. Doc's out at the Baxter Ranch." Someone volunteered. "Won't be back till tomorrow." Clara absorbed this without comment. She'd handled worse with less. "Then bring me hot water, clean bandages, and laudanum from the general store. Move." They carried Samuel to their room above the stable, Clara directing every movement. Once they'd laid him on the bed, she sent everyone away except Mrs. Chen, who appeared with an armload of clean cloth. "What do you need?" the seamstress asked simply. "Hold his shoulders. I need to set this leg before he wakes." Together they worked, Clara drawing on every skill learned in field hospitals. The leg set cleanly, and she bound it with strips of wood from a broken crate. The head wound worried her more, a deep gash and significant swelling that spoke of concussion at minimum. Samuel remained unconscious through it all, a mercy given the pain. Clara cleaned and stitched the head wound, then settled in to wait, Mrs. Chen brought tea and food Clara couldn't eat, then retreated with a promise to return. Night fell. Clara lit the lamp and maintained her vigil, checking Samuel's pulse, watching for signs of fever or distress. Sometimes he muttered fragments of memory or dream. Once, clear as day, he said her name. Near midnight, his eyes opened. For a moment they were unfocused, confused. Then they found her face. Clara. I'm here. She gripped his hand. You're safe. You were thrown. But you're going to be all right. He tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, and fell back. The stallion is fine. You're the one who got damaged. She smoothed his hair back from the bandage. Your leg is broken. You have a concussion. You need to lie still. How bad? She appreciated that he asked directly, without pretense. The leg will heal clean if you don't abuse it. 6 weeks minimum. The head injury, we'll have to watch. But I've seen worse recover fully. He absorbed this, then squeezed her hand weakly. You've done this before. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Many times. During the war. You were a nurse. Among other things. She adjusted his pillow slightly. Rest now. We can talk when you're stronger. But he held on to consciousness with stubborn will. Clara, the horses, someone needs to... Already handled. Jim Morrison from the Double Bar came by. He'll cover your work until you're healed. Can't afford to lose the wages. Samuel McRae. She used her sternest voice. You nearly died today. Let me worry about money. He studied her face in the lamplight. You were scared. Terrified. She admitted, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just heal. She touched his cheek gently. Sleep now. I'll be here. This time he obeyed, slipping back into healing unconsciousness. Clara maintained her watch, thinking about the cruel ironies of life. She'd married him as a business arrangement, a mutual convenience. Somewhere along the way, convenience had transformed into care, and care into something deeper she didn't yet have words for. The next days passed in a blur of caregiving. Doctor. Harmon confirmed her treatment when he finally arrived, complimenting her skill with barely hidden surprise. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, the head injury leaving him confused and sometimes agitated. On the third night, fever set in. Clara had been expecting it, hoping against it, but prepared. She bathed his face with cool water, forced willow bark tea between his lips, and fought the infection with every trick learned in battlefield medicine. He rambled in his delirium, speaking to people who weren't there, his parents, his brother, fellow soldiers from the war, and Clara, always Clara, her name a constant thread through his fevered words. Can't lose her, he muttered, gripping her hand with surprising strength. Just found her. Can't lose. You won't, she whispered back. I'm not going anywhere. Mrs. Chen came daily, bringing food and taking over the shop duties. The Vargas family sent Rosita with fresh eggs and prayers. Even Mrs. Thornton appeared with a pot of soup and awkward sympathy. Is there anything else you need? She asked, uncomfortable in the small room but making the effort. Just prayers, Clara said, too tired for pride. And perhaps someone to help with the heavier stable work. The horses need tending. Word spread, and help arrived. Men from neighboring ranches took shifts with the horses. Women brought food and offers of assistance. The same community that had gossiped about their marriage now rallied to support them. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Clara woke from a light doze to find Samuel watching her with clear eyes. You look terrible, he said weakly. She laughed, surprising them both. You're not exactly at your best either. How long? 5 days. You had me worried. She checked his forehead, cool and dry. How do you feel? Like I was kicked by a horse. He attempted a smile. Which I suppose I was. Thrown, not kicked,
important difference. Clara, his voice turned serious. Thank you. It's what wives do, she said lightly, but he caught her hand. No, it's what you do, what you've always done. I think putting people back together. She couldn't answer, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. I remember pieces. He continued. You talking to me, telling me to fight, saying you... He paused, uncertain. Did you say you needed me? Heat rose in her cheeks. You were delirious. I said many things to keep you with us. With us or with you? The question hung between them, requiring an honesty she wasn't sure she was ready for, but looking at him pale and injured but alive. So wonderfully alive, she found the courage. With me, she admitted quietly. I've grown accustomed to having you around. Samuel McRae, it would be inconvenient if you died. Inconvenient. He tested the word, a smile playing at his lips. Is that what we're calling it? What would you call it? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, love, I'd call it love. Clara. The word settled between them like a bird finding its nest. Natural. Right. True. That's highly impractical, she said, but her hand tightened on his. Most good things are. She leaned down and kissed him then, their first real kiss since the perfunctory peck at their wedding. It was gentle, careful of his injuries, but it held promise of deeper things when health returned. When she pulled back, he was smiling. Worth getting thrown for that. Don't you dare get thrown again, she warned. My nerves can't take it. Recovery was slow but steady. Samuel chafed at the enforced inactivity, but Clara was ruthless about his rest. She moved her sewing work to their room, keeping him company while ensuring he didn't overexert himself. They talked during those long days, really talked, sharing stories they'd held back before. Samuel spoke of the war, of the brother he'd lost, of the farm burned for loyalty to the wrong side. Clara told him about the field hospitals, the boys who'd died calling for their mothers, the skills learned in blood and necessity. We're a matched pair, Samuel observed one afternoon, both trying to build new lives from the ashes of old ones. And succeeding, Clara added, together. The town's support continued through his recovery. The miners who'd caused such trouble seemed subdued by the community's unity, and several even contributed to a fund started for the McRae's support. It wasn't enough to change Clara's opinion of them, but it was a start. 6 weeks after the accident, Samuel took his first steps on the mended leg. Clara watched anxiously as he tested his weight, ready to catch him if he fell. It holds, he said with satisfaction. Little stiff, but it holds. You'll need to strengthen it slowly. No horsework for another month at least. He pulled her close with his free arm. I have an excellent nurse. I'm sure she'll keep me in line. See that you listen to her, Clara said, but she was smiling. That night, as they lay together in their narrow bed, no longer maintaining any pretense of separate sleeping arrangements, Samuel traced patterns on her arm with gentle fingers. When I was lying there, after the horse threw me, he said quietly, my last clear thought was regret, that I'd never told you how I felt, that we'd wasted time on propriety and careful distance. We're frontier people. Clara replied, we're supposed to be practical. Practical be damned. His arm tightened around her. I love you. Clara Bennett McRae. Not practically, not conveniently, completely. She turned in his arms to face him. And I love you, Samuel, despite my best efforts to remain sensibly detached. They kissed again, longer this time, full of promise and passion held in check these many months. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. So what now? Samuel asked. Do we tell people we've fallen in love with our own spouse? Clara laughed. I think they've figured it out. Mrs. Chen told me yesterday that it was about time we stopped pretending. Wise woman. The wisest. They settled into comfortable silence.
the night sounds of the stable below a familiar lullaby. Clara thought about the strange journey that had brought them here from that first night by the dying fire to this moment of acknowledged love. Not the path she'd expected when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, but perhaps the one she'd needed. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, as if reading her thoughts. "None," Clara said firmly. "Not one." And it was true. The practical marriage had become a love match. The convenient arrangement, a true partnership. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as necessity, revealing their true nature only when you were brave enough to look beneath the surface. Outside their window, Red Hollow slept peacefully. The troubles weren't over. There would always be challenges in a frontier town. But Clara and Samuel would face them together now, no longer held apart by careful distance, but united in acknowledged love. The accident that could have ended everything had instead broken down the last walls between them. And in the breaking, they'd found something worth more than safety or propriety. They'd found home in each other. Autumn came early that year, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust. Samuel had fully recovered from his injury, though he walked with a slight limp on cold mornings, a reminder of how quickly life could change. Clara had moved her sewing work permanently to their expanded quarters above the stable, transforming the space into a real home with curtains at the windows and rag rugs on the floor. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the letter arrived that would test their newfound happiness. Clara was fitting Mrs. Morrison for a new winter coat when Samuel appeared in the doorway, an envelope in his hand and an uncertain expression on his face. "Letter for you," he said, "from Kansas City." Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. She'd left no forwarding address, had no one there who would seek her out. Unless... "I'll be back in a moment. Mrs. Morrison," she said, maintaining her composure. In the privacy of their bedroom, she opened the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature made her sink onto the bed. "What is it?" Samuel asked, sitting beside her. "My aunt," Clara said numbly. "My mother's sister. I was told she died years ago." The letter was brief but shocking. Aunt Margaret was very much alive, living in Kansas City, and had spent the last 2 years searching for her only remaining family. She'd recently learned of Clara's whereabouts through a mutual acquaintance who'd passed through Red Hollow. She wanted Clara to come home to claim her rightful inheritance from her mother's estate, which Margaret had been safeguarding. "I don't understand," Clara said. "My parents' property was sold to pay debts. There was nothing left." Samuel read the letter carefully. "She says there were investments your mother made separately, property holdings that weren't part of the estate settlement. Enough to live comfortably, to not have to work." Clara looked at him, seeing her own confusion reflected in his eyes. "She wants me to come back, to live with her in Kansas City." The room seemed to shrink around them. Samuel stood, moving to the window. "It's a good opportunity," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The kind of life you were meant for, before." "Before what?" Clara rose, anger sparking. "Before I learned to survive on my own, before I found work I'm good at before I married you." He turned to face her. "I'm saying you have choices now. Real choices, not decisions made from necessity. You think our marriage was just necessity?" "Wasn't it?" The words came out harsh. "You needed protection from gossip. I needed... hell, I don't even know anymore. But this..." He gestured at the letter. "This changes things." Clara felt as if she'd been slapped. "Does it because I thought what we had was..." "What, love?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Love doesn't put food on the table. Clara, love doesn't give you the life you deserve, the life you had before circumstances forced you here." "Forced me?" Clara's voice rose. "Is that what you think, that I'm here against my will?" "Aren't you..." They stared at each other across a chasm that hadn't existed an hour ago. Clara saw fear in his eyes, fear of losing her, twisted into preemptive rejection. "I need air," she said, pushing past him.
She walked blindly through the streets of Red Hollow. The letter crumpled in her fist. The town that had become home looked different now, smaller somehow. She passed Mrs. Chen's shop, the church where they'd married, the spot where Samuel had faced down the miners for her.
"I'm Mrs. McRae."
Clara turned to find Rosita Vargas, now 12 and growing tall, concern written on her young face.
"Are you crying?" Clara touched her cheek, surprised to find it wet. "I suppose I am."
"Is it because of Mr. Samuel? Is he hurt again?" "No, dear, he's fine." Rosita studied her with those two wise eyes.
"Mama says sometimes people hurt each other worse with words than with fists."
From the mouths of children. Again, Clara attempted a smile.
"Your mama is a smart woman. She also says that people who love each other sometimes say stupid things when they're scared."
Rosita patted Clara's hand with a childlike solemnity.
"Maybe Mr. Samuel is scared."
Clara walked Rosita home, the girl's simple wisdom echoing in her mind. By the time she returned to the stable, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. She found Samuel in the stable proper, brushing down his horse with mechanical precision. He didn't look up when she entered.
"We need to talk," she said.
"Nothing to talk about. You should go to Kansas City, see what's waiting for you there."
"And if I don't want to?"
His hands stilled on the brush. "Why wouldn't you? It's everything you lost getting restored. A chance to be a lady again instead of a frontier seamstress married to a stable hand." Clara moved closer, ducking under the horse's neck to face him. "Samuel McRae, you listen to me. I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it." He finally met her eyes, and she saw all his fear and pain laid bare.
"I didn't lose anything," she said firmly. "I left it behind. There's a difference. The life I had in Kansas City, the proper lady with soft hands and no useful skills, that woman wouldn't have survived what I've survived. She wouldn't have found purpose in her work or strength in adversity. She wouldn't have fallen in love with a stubborn horseman who tries to push away the people he loves most."
"Clara." "I'm not finished." She took the brush from his hands, setting it aside.
"You want to know what I choose.
Not from necessity, not from limited options,
but from genuine choice. I choose this life. I choose my work, my friends, my home. I choose you.
Even knowing you could have better."
"Better than what? Better than a husband who risked his life to save mine. Better than work that uses my true skills. Better than a community that's become family." She cupped his face in her hands. "Samuel, there is no better. There's only different. And I don't want different. I want this. I want us."
He pulled her against him then, holding her as if she might disappear.
"I'm sorry,"
he whispered into her hair. "I was so scared of losing you. I tried to push you away first."
"I know."
She held him just as tightly.
"But I'm not going anywhere. We're stuck with each other, remember, for better or worse. Even if I'm sometimes an idiot."
"Especially then. Someone has to keep you in line." They stood there in the stable, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. Finally, Samuel pulled back enough to look at her.
"You should still go to Kansas City,"
he said, and when she started to protest, he continued quickly.
"To see your aunt, to understand what's being offered. But together,
we'll go together."
Clara considered this. "You'd leave your work."
"Morrison owes me time off after covering for him last spring, and—" He smiled slightly. "I'm curious to see where you came from, to understand that part of you." They made the journey 2 weeks later, taking the train from the county seat. Clara wore her best dress, one she'd made herself, noting with satisfaction that it was finer than anything she'd owned in her previous life. Samuel wore his wedding suit, looking uncomfortable but determined. Kansas City had grown in her absence, spreading like spilled ink across the prairie. Aunt Margaret's house stood in a respectable neighborhood, all peaked roofs and painted shutters. Clara felt Samuel tense beside her as they approached the door.
"Remember,"
she said, squeezing his hand,
We're just visiting." Aunt Margaret proved to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, dressed in mourning black despite the years since her husband's passing. She examined Samuel with barely concealed skepticism, and Clara with a mixture of affection and dismay. "You've changed," she said over tea in the precisely decorated parlor. "You're harder somehow." "Stronger," Clara corrected gently. "I've learned to be strong." They discussed the inheritance several properties that generated steady income, enough to live comfortably indeed. Aunt Margaret outlined her plans. Clara would live with her, rejoin society, perhaps remarry someone suitable. "I'm already married," Clara pointed out. Her aunt's glance at Samuel dismissed him entirely. "Such things can be remedied." Samuel's hand found Clara's under the table. She squeezed it reassuringly. "Aunt Margaret," Clara said carefully, "I appreciate all you've done to preserve Mother's investments, but I have a life in Red Hollow. A good life. Doing what manual labor living above a stable." Her aunt's voice dripped disapproval. "Your mother would be horrified." "My mother wanted me to be happy," Clara said firmly. "And I am." They stayed 3 days, long enough for Clara to understand what she was refusing and to make peace with that refusal. She arranged for the property income to be sent to Red Hollow. It would allow them to expand, perhaps build a proper house, certainly to help others in the community who struggled. On their last morning, Aunt Margaret made one final appeal. "You could have your old life back, Clara, the life you were born to." Clara looked at Samuel, who stood by the window, trying to make himself invisible in this world of doilies and delicate china. She thought of their small room above the stable, of Mrs. Chen's quiet friendship, of Rosita's eager face during sewing lessons. "I don't want my old life back," she said simply. "I want the life I built, the life I chose." The train ride home was quiet, both of them processing the weight of the decision. As the prairie rolled by, Samuel finally spoke. "No regrets." "None." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "Though I am looking forward to indoor plumbing." He laughed, the sound washing away the last of the tension. "We could build a house, a real house, with your mother's money." "Our money," she corrected. "And yes, I think we should. Something simple but solid, with a room for my sewing and space for children, if we're blessed with them." "Children," Samuel repeated, wonder in his voice. "I hadn't dared hope." "Well, start hoping," Clara said. "We've got a future to build." Red Hollow appeared on the horizon as the sun set, painting the little town gold. It wasn't much to look at: rough buildings, dusty streets, more saloons than churches, but it was theirs. "Home," Samuel said, and Clara heard the satisfaction in his voice. "Home," she agreed. That night, as they lay in their narrow bed above the stable, Clara thought about choices, those made from necessity and those made from love. Sometimes they were the same thing. Sometimes necessity taught you what love really looked like, not grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but daily decisions to build something together. "Thank you," Samuel said into the darkness. "For what?" "For choosing us, for choosing this." Clara turned in his arms to kiss him. "It was the easiest choice I've ever made." And it was true. Faced with comfort and society in Kansas City, or love and purpose in Red Hollow, there had been no real decision to make. She'd already chosen. Every day since that first night when Samuel had rebuilt her dying fire, she'd chosen with each stitch sewn, each meal shared, each quiet evening spent in companionable silence. The inheritance would help them build a better life, but it wouldn't change who they were or what they'd made together. They were Clara and Samuel McRae of Red Hollow, and that was exactly who they wanted to be. The winter of their second year as a true married couple arrived with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the peace in their lives. The new house stood on the edge of town, nothing grand, but solid and well built, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light. Clara's sewing room occupied the entire eastern corner, with shelves for fabric and a proper cutting table. Samuel had his workshop attached to the small stable, where he'd begun training horses for ranchers throughout the county. It was a December evening, snow falling soft as whispers. When Clara set down her sewing and placed a hand on her belly, the movement she'd been feeling for weeks had grown stronger, more insistent, a tiny life making itself known. Samuel looked up from the harness he was mending by the fire. "Are you well?" "Very well," she smiled, a secret dancing in her eyes. "Though I think I'll need to let out my dresses soon." He set aside his work, concern creasing his brow. "Have you been eating enough? You've seemed tired lately." "Samuel." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I'm eating for two now." The transformation of his face from confusion to understanding to joy was something she would treasure forever. He knelt before her chair, both hands gentle on her belly. Truly, come spring, we'll have a little one to keep us busy." He pulled her down into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that made her throat tight. "A child? Our child?" "Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to describe it. He pulled back to look at her, wonder in his eyes. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks. I wanted to be certain before I told you." She touched his face. "I know we didn't plan." "The best things in our life weren't planned," he interrupted. "You weren't planned. This wasn't planned. But I can't imagine anything I want more." That night, as they lay entwined in their bed, a proper bed now, wide enough for two and sturdy enough to last generations, they talked about the future with a new dimension. Names were debated, plans were made, dreams were shared. "I hope it's a girl," Samuel said, surprising her, "with your strength and your eyes." "And if it's a boy?" "Then I'll teach him to be the kind of man who deserves a woman like his mother." The winter passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Clara continued her sewing work, though she hired young Annie Morrison to help with the heavier tasks. The girl reminded Clara of herself at that age, eager to learn, quick with a needle, carrying her own quiet sorrows. Mrs. Chen became a constant visitor, sharing wisdom from her own pregnancies and quietly knitting tiny garments. The Vargas family contributed a beautifully carved cradle, made by Mr. Vargas in the evenings after his ranch work. "For the one who taught our Rosita," he said simply when they protested it was too much. Even Mrs. Thornton, who'd been so disapproving in the beginning, arrived with a stack of soft blankets and awkward congratulations. The town had embraced them fully now, the strange tall woman and the quiet horseman who'd found each other through necessity and stayed together through choice. Spring arrived in a rush of green and gold, and with it, the pains that signaled their child's arrival. Clara, who'd delivered dozens of babies during the war, found herself on the other side of the experience, gripping Samuel's hand as Mrs. Chen and Dr. Harmon attended her. "You're doing fine," Samuel whispered, though his face was pale with worry. "You're the strongest person I know." "Strength has nothing to do with it," Clara gasped between contractions. "This child has your stubborn nature taking their own sweet time." But when their daughter finally arrived, pink and perfect and loud as a cavalry charge, time seemed to stop. Samuel held the baby with shaking hands, tears streaming unashamed down his weathered cheeks. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise you, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you and your mama." They named her Margaret, after Clara's mother, but called her Maggie. She had Clara's determined chin and Samuel's dark eyes, and from the first moment, she owned their hearts completely. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of feedings and diapers, first smiles and sleepless nights. But there were moments of perfect clarity too, Samuel singing soft cowboy lullabies in the pre-dawn darkness. Clara nursing the baby while spring rain pattered against the windows, the three of them napping together on Sunday afternoons. "She's growing so fast," Clara said one evening as summer approached. Maggie lay between them on a blanket in the grass, watching the stars appear with a solemn baby concentration. "They do that," Samuel agreed, though his own wonder at their daughter hadn't diminished. "Before we know it, she'll be walking, talking, riding horses." "Let's not rush things," Clara laughed. "I'd like to enjoy her being small for a while." "Are you happy?" It was the same question she'd asked him months ago, but now Samuel posed it, studying her face in the fading light. Clara considered. Her life bore no resemblance to what she'd once imagined. Instead of hosting tea parties in Kansas City, she was raising a child in a frontier town. Instead of servants and silk dresses, she had work-roughened hands and practical cotton. Instead of a marriage of convenience to someone of her own class, she had a love match with a former stable hand. "Happier than I knew was possible," she said finally. "This life, our life, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Maggie chose that moment to grab her father's finger, holding tight with surprising baby strength. Samuel's face softened into an expression Clara had come to know well: pure, uncomplicated love. "You know," he said, "that first night, when I found you by the fire, I thought I was just helping a stranger in need. I never imagined—" "What?" "That you were my future sitting there in the cold, that every lonely year had been leading me to that moment." He looked at her across their daughter's small form. "Do you believe in fate?" "Clara." "I believe in choices," she said. "1,000 small choices that lead us where we need to be. You chose to help a stranger. I chose to stay. We chose each other over and over until choosing became as natural as breathing." Maggie gurgled, as if adding her own opinion to the conversation. They laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie evening. Later, after Maggie was settled in her cradle and the house had quieted for the night, Clara stood by the window, looking out at Red Hollow. The town slept peacefully, lamplights glowing in windows like earthbound stars. Somewhere a dog barked, and further off, coyotes sang their ancient songs. Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "About fires," she said. "How that first night, my fire was dying, just embers, barely warm enough to keep the cold at bay. And now," she turned in his arms to face him, "now it burns bright enough to warm a whole family, strong enough to last through any storm." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, full of promise and shared memory. When they pulled apart, she could see their future stretching before them, more children perhaps. Years of work and love and small daily choices that built a life worth living. "No regrets?" he asked, their old question given new meaning. "Not one," she answered, as she always did. "Not a single one." They stood together at the window, watching over their sleeping town, their sleeping daughter. Their life built from ashes and determination and love discovered in the most unexpected places. The fire in their hearth burned steadily, casting warm shadows on the walls of their home. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside all was warmth and light and the quiet contentment of dreams fulfilled. Clara thought of that scared, proud woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 2 years ago and felt only compassion for her. That woman couldn't have imagined this, couldn't have known that sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in hardship, that love could grow from the simple act of rebuilding a dying fire. But this Clara wife, mother, valued member of her community, she knew. She knew that home wasn't a place you came from, but a place you built, one choice at a time. She knew that strength wasn't about standing alone, but about knowing when to accept help. And she knew that love, real love, wasn't a lightning strike, but a steady flame, tended daily, warming everything it touched. In her cradle, Maggie stirred and sighed, dreaming baby dreams. Samuel's arms tightened around Clara, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new small moments that would weave themselves into the tapestry of their shared life. But tonight, in this moment, they had everything they needed: A home built with their own hands, a community that had become family, a love that had grown from convenience to necessity to the bedrock of their existence, and a fire that would never die because they tended it together. Thank you so much for joining me on Clara and Samuel's journey in the frontier town of Red Hollow. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this story. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected love and the courage to build a new life, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories of the American frontier. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, partners.